Silent waters conceal the darkest secrets. One reckless dive could reveal what's been buried in the shadows for decades. A story you won't be able to look away from begins now. Comment where you're watching from, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The heat over the Louisiana bayou hung like a living thing. Air shimmered above the water, thick with humidity, and the sound of cicadas that screeched from the trees. The river glistened dull and slow, and on its banks, among the moss-draped oaks, stood a small wooden house where Jack Harper lived alone. He was a man carved by water and time, his hands rough, his shoulders broad, his skin tanned from years of work under the sun. Once, he had served in the Navy as a deep-sea diver. Now, years later, he worked where others feared to go, descending into dark rivers and forgotten holes to clean, weld, or retrieve what had been lost. Above the surface, the world always felt too loud, too fast. Underwater, there was silence, and in that silence, Jack found peace. It was late afternoon when the phone rang. Jack sat on his porch with a bottle of cold beer, staring out over the swamp. He almost ignored the sound. His calls rarely brought good news, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, a man used to being obeyed. He introduced himself as Greg Sanders from Delta Marine Industries, a shipping company out of Baton Rouge. His company, he explained, had recently purchased an old freighter named Magnolia Star. It had been abandoned for years on a private pier near the small river town of Belchase. They wanted to restore it, but the propeller was jammed by a massive chain that none of their workers could clear. Sanders said they needed a man with Navy-grade experience. The pay would be generous. Very generous. Jack listened in silence, suspicion building beneath his calm exterior. Jobs like this never came without a catch. The money sounded too good. Still, bills were piling up. Work had been scarce lately, and the old house was wearing thin. Against his instincts, he asked the usual questions. How long had the ship been abandoned? Why hadn't local crews handled it? What exactly blocked the propeller? The answers came smooth, but empty. You'll see when you get there, Sanders said. It's a simple job for someone with your background. Just cut the chain, free the propeller, and we'll take care of the rest. After he hung up, Jack sat for a long time in silence. The cicadas screamed louder. He rubbed the stubble on his jaw and stared at the fading sunlight that turned the water red. The job felt wrong, but something about it called to him. Maybe it was the challenge, maybe the promise of pay, or maybe, deep down, he just needed to go back under again. 2 days later, Jack loaded his truck with diving gear, tanks, and tools, then headed south. The road narrowed into gravel paths that snaked between swamp and shadow. Spanish moss hung from the trees like old lace. The further he drove, the quieter it became. The GPS lost signal long before he saw the pier. Finally, the trees opened, revealing the Magnolia Star. She loomed above the still water. Rusted and broken, her name barely legible on the hull. Once a cargo vessel, she now looked like a corpse of metal and rot. The air around her smelled of decay and diesel. Jack parked beside a weathered shack that leaned toward the river. The boards groaned under his boots as he stepped out. A man emerged from the shadows, a tall figure in a dirty white shirt, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. "You Harper?" he asked. His voice was dry, as if he hadn't spoken much lately. Jack nodded. "Fred Holloway." "Foreman here," the man said, and offered a handshake that was firm but cold. "You've got the job. We need that propeller cleared. No delays." They walked together down the creaking pier toward the ship. The Magnolia Star towered over them like a ghost. Her hull was streaked with rust, her decks sagging. "She's been sitting here near 20 years, Holloway said. "We're supposed to get her ready for towing next month, but the damn propeller's locked. Chain wrapped around it tight as a snake." He gestured to the stern. Even from a distance, Jack could see something glinting just beneath the surface. a dull metallic coil that reflected faintly in the water. Jack crouched, squinting at the pattern of rust and shadow. The links were massive, thicker than anything used on standard anchors. He frowned. "You sure this was part of the ship's original rigging?" he asked. Holloway's eyes flicked toward him, then back to the water. "That's what they told me," he said quickly. His tone didn't match his words. Jack noticed it. Years in the service had taught him to read what men didn't say. After a brief inspection, Jack agreed to start work the next morning. The foreman gave him a small room above the shack bare walls, one cot and a fan that rattled like loose screws. Outside, the river lapped quietly against the hull of the Magnolia Star. The sound should have soothed him, but it didn't. There was something wrong about the silence here. To complete, no frogs, no birds, just the slow breathing of the water. That night, he couldn't sleep. The air pressed against him like a weight. Through the thin walls, he heard the faint groan of the ship, as though it shifted in its moorings. Once, half dreaming, he thought he heard chains dragging under the pier, soft, distant, rhythmic. When he opened his eyes, the sound was gone. Before dawn, he rose and prepared his gear. The ritual steadied him. Check the valves, test the mask, secure the harness, tighten the blade at his thigh. It was muscle memory, a pattern older than fear. He stepped out into the mist. Holloway stood on the pier with a clipboard, watching without a word. Jack ignored him. He climbed down the side of the ship, feeling the metal warm beneath his hands even in the early hour. He paused at the edge, staring into the dark water that reflected nothing. The chain below gleamed faintly in the weak light. He tightened the straps on his mask, took a deep breath, and slipped beneath the surface. The world closed around him at once. Cool, green, and silent. His lamp cut through the murk in a narrow cone, illuminating drifting particles that danced like dust in an empty room. The hull of the Magnolia Star stretched above him like the belly of some sleeping beast. He moved slowly, feeling along the metal until his light fell on the chain. The sight made him stop. The links were enormous, each one thick as his forearm, covered in rust and barnacles. They weren't just tangled. They were coiled tightly around the propeller, strangling it. He ran a gloved hand over one link. The texture was rough, pitted, but solid. This wasn't ordinary anchor chain. It was heavier, older. The kind used on ships from another era. He tugged gently, testing the resistance. The chain didn't budge. It stretched down deeper, disappearing into darkness that his light couldn't reach. He frowned. It wasn't cut or broken, was connected to something below, something massive. A chill crawled up his spine. He checked his depth gauge, the slow bubbles rising past his faceplate, the hiss of air loud in his ears. He wanted to follow the chain, to see where it led. But something in him, an old instinct, whispered to stop. He turned upward, the light fading into green gloom, and kicked toward the surface. As his head broke the water, he tore off the mask and drew a long breath. The air was thick, heavy with heat. Holloway was still standing on the pier, watching him. Problem. The foreman called. Jack shook his head. "Jet," he said, but his voice was tight. He climbed the ladder, water streaming from his suit, and for a moment he stood staring down at the river. Beneath that surface, something waited, something more than rust and chain. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This job was not what he'd been told it was, and whatever lay at the end of that chain had been meant to stay buried. The morning rose over the bayou like a pale ghost, the mist crawling low over the water. Jack Harper stood on the deck of the Magnolia Star, pulling the straps of his harness tight. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rust. The foreman, Fred Holloway, lingered nearby, pretending to check notes on his clipboard, but clearly watching Jack's every move. Jack ignored him. Years of diving had taught him that silence was often safer than small talk. He focused on his routine, checking each valve, tapping his pressure gauge, adjusting his headlamp. Each motion grounded him, pushed away the unease that had haunted him since yesterday's dive. He told himself that what he saw could be explained. Snagged chain may be connected to an old anchor, nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. The weight in his chest said otherwise. He lowered himself into the water with practiced ease. The sound of the world above disappeared, replaced by the muffled hiss of his regulator and the soft rhythm of bubbles. The light faded almost immediately, replaced by the dim green gloom of the river. The Magnolia Star's massive hull loomed above him, stretching like the side of a sunken beast. He moved carefully, not stirring up too much silt. The beam of his lamp carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing the propeller he'd seen before, still frozen in place, still bound by the chain. Up close, it looked worse. The links were larger than he remembered, thick and ancient, as though forged in another century. They weren't draped loosely. They were wound around the blades tightly, each link locked against the next in a way that seemed deliberate. He reached out, scraping away a layer of barnacles with his glove, and ran his fingers along the rusted metal. It wasn't like any anchor chain he'd seen on civilian ships. It was heavy-duty, the kind used on military vessels built for endurance. Jack frowned behind his mask. Why would a cargo ship have something like this binding its propeller? He followed the links downward. The chain extended far deeper than he expected. He adjusted his buoyancy and descended, hand over hand, each motion sending faint vibrations through the water. The pressure grew around him as the light above dimmed further. His breath sounded louder now, mechanical and steady, filling the emptiness. The silt thickened, swirling in clouds around his legs. He kept going, his lamp searching through the gloom until something massive emerged below. At first, it was only a shadow. Then the outline sharpened. A wall of steel, curved and riveted. It was a ship. The realization stopped him cold. The structure wasn't broken apart like most wrecks he'd seen. 'Twas intact, sitting upright on the riverbed as if it had lain down to sleep. The chain led straight to it, vanishing into the hole through what looked like an anchor mount. Jack's heartbeat thudded in his ears. He raised his lamp higher, sweeping the beam across the surface. Algae and rust clung to every inch of the metal, hiding its true shape. But the lines were unmistakable. This was no barge. This was a warship. He floated motionless, staring at the relic beneath him. The current brushed against his suit, carrying the faint taste of oil and decay. He'd dived on military wrecks before, but none this close to the bayou, none this well preserved. The government usually had records, designations, maps, but there was nothing like this listed in local waters. He swam closer, tracing the riveted seams with his hand until his lamp caught something that made his stomach tighten. Faded letters, half hidden beneath growth, ghosted across the steel plating. USS Henderson. Jack froze. He knew that name. The Henderson had vanished during a wartime transport mission decades ago. Somewhere in the Gulf, official reports said it was lost to a storm, unrecovered. Yet here it was, buried beneath a rusted freighter, shackled by a chain thick enough to pull it from history. He felt the pulse of fear then, not the sharp kind that urged retreat, but the deep, ancient one that came when a man realized he had stumbled upon something he was never meant to see. He circled the wreck slowly, cautious not to disturb the silt. The hole stretched longer than he expected. The bow tilted slightly upward, as though reaching toward the light that never came. Strange patterns marked the steel, long scratches that looked almost like burns. He drifted along the side, eyes scanning the darkness. A low groan echoed through the water, a sound so faint he thought at first it was in his head. But then it came again, deeper this time, resonating through the metal. The ship was moving just barely, shifting under the weight of the current. His air gauge blinked. He'd been down longer than he realized. Reluctantly, he turned upward. The beam of his lamp fell once more on the thick links of the chain, still taut, still binding the two ships together. The dead and the dying. He kicked off the bottom, rising slowly toward the dull glow above. The weight of what he'd seen pressed heavier than the water itself. When he broke the surface, the sunlight seemed harsh and foreign. He pulled off his mask and gulped air. Holloway was waiting on the pier, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Well," he called. Jack treaded water, thinking fast. He couldn't tell him what he'd found. Not yet. "Propellers wrapped tight," he said finally. "Chains heavy. I'll need to bring up cutting gear." Holloway's eyes narrowed. "You see where it runs?" Jack hesitated. Down into the mud. Couldn't get a clear view. It wasn't a lie, not completely. The foreman studied him a moment longer, then gave a short nod. "Fine. We'll get you what you need." Jack climbed the ladder, his muscles aching. The heat hit him like a wall as he stripped off his gear. He didn't look at Holloway again. The man's silence was too pointed to calm. Something in it warned Jack that his discovery wasn't news to everyone here. He sat on the edge of the pier, staring into the murky water where the chain disappeared. Beneath it lay a piece of history that no one wanted found. That night, the swamp was restless. The cries of insects came and went in strange waves, like the sound was being swallowed by the air. Jack lay on the narrow bed in the shack, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above him. His mind replayed the image of the Henderson, chained and waiting in the dark. He thought about the Navy reports, about the way stories vanish when no one wants them told. He thought about the chain itself, too deliberate to be an accident. Sleep never came. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the letters on the hull, the silent plea of a ship forgotten by time. When the first light crept through the cracks in the wall, Jack sat up, drenched in sweat. The water outside was calm, as if nothing stirred beneath it. But he knew better. Something was down there, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The air over the river was still when Jack Harper prepared for his second dive. The fog clung to the water like breath on glass, blurring the line between the world above and the one below. He moved through the motions of assembling his gear in silence, his mind replaying every image from the day before. The warship, the chain, the ghostly letters on the hull. He had seen wrecks before, but nothing like this. There had been no reports, no salvage marks, no sign anyone had ever known it was here. That meant it had been hidden deliberately. The thought stayed with him as he stepped off the pier and descended once more into the dark. The light of the morning vanished quickly under the surface. His lamp pierced the murk in a narrow cone, illuminating nothing but drifting silt until the massive outline of the USS Henderson appeared again, looming out of the green depths like a shadow with a heartbeat. The current was slow, the water colder. Jack's breath echoed loud and even in his ears. He swam closer to the hole, tracing the length of the chain to the point where it disappeared into the steel. His glove brushed the metal and flakes of rust drifted away like ash. He felt as if he were touching something alive, something that had been waiting for him. He angled his light toward a gap along the deck, a broken hatch, gaping open. The edges were jagged, torn by pressure or explosion, but still wide enough for him to fit through. For a moment he hovered there, torn between instinct and curiosity. Instinct said to leave it alone. Curiosity drove him forward. He squeezed through the opening, careful not to snag his hoses, and entered the ship. Inside, the world turned smaller and quieter. The beam of his lamp stretched only a few feet ahead, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with pipes and corroded panels. The walls were coated in layers of slime and silt that fluttered with every movement of water. He moved slowly, one hand trailing the wall, his heart beating steady against the hum of his regulator. The silence here was different from the open river. It felt thick, heavy, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. As he turned a corner, the corridor opened into a wider compartment. Rows of large containers filled the space, stacked unevenly. Some collapsed under their own weight. Jack swam closer, his light sweeping across them. The markings were faint but recognizable, stamped military codes, hazard symbols, faded letters, warning of chemical contents. His chest tightened. He had seen these kinds of barrels before during training, in briefings about weapons disposal. They were meant to be sealed and buried, never opened again. These had ruptured. From the cracks oozed a dark, oily substance that shimmered in his light, spreading in thin, rainbow-colored waves across the floor. He recoiled slightly, instinctively holding his breath, though his mask sealed him from the water. The slick drifted toward him before dispersing into the current, and the sight made his stomach twist. He realized then that the chain wasn't just an anchor. The Magnolia Star above wasn't just a rusted freighter. It was a cover. Someone had chained this wreck to the bottom of the river to hide it, to bury its poison beneath another ship. And for years, the river had carried that poison downstream, into the bayous, into the towns, into the people. He backed away, the lamp trembling slightly in his grip. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but he forced himself to steady his breathing and took another long look at the barrels. The markings were almost gone, but one was still legible enough to capture in his mind. Hazard Class 6.2 biological material. It wasn't just toxic waste, it was something far worse. He turned and made his way out of the compartment, the silt swirling in his wake. The moment he passed back through the hatch and into open water, he felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. The pressure of the deep seemed lighter than the weight of what he had just seen. He followed the chain back toward the surface, his mind racing faster than his ascent. When he broke through into the humid air, he pulled off his mask and gulped the thick, hot atmosphere like a drowning man. Fred Holloway was waiting on the pier again, his expression sharp and expectant. "Find anything?" he called. Jack shook his head. "Just more of the same," he said, forcing his voice to sound casual. "Chains tight. Might take a few more dives." Holloway studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Keep at it. We're on a schedule." His eyes lingered too long before he turned away, walking back toward the shack. Jack climbed onto the pier, stripping off his gear piece by piece. The boards creaked under his weight. He sat on the edge, staring at the river where the chain disappeared into the dark, and felt the first true wave of dread settle over him. He knew what he had found. He knew what it meant. But he also knew that speaking it aloud would be dangerous. Men like Holloway didn't work for shipping companies. They worked for people who preferred their mistakes to stay buried. That night, the air in the shack felt heavier than ever. The fan clicked and hummed, barely cutting through the heat. Jack sat at the small table, his hands still trembling slightly from the dive. Every time he blinked, he saw those barrels again, leaking their poison into the riverbed. He thought of the people living along these waters, the fishermen hauling their nets, the families who drew drinking water from the wells nearby, the kids who swam on summer afternoons. He remembered overhearing stories in town of strange illnesses, dead fish, animals dying without reason. He hadn't believed them then. Now he did. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. His conscience felt heavier than any dive gear he'd ever worn. The logical thing would be to pack up, drive away, pretend he'd never seen the Henderson. But he couldn't. Not after what he'd witnessed. If he left, no one would ever know. The poison would keep flowing, and the people would keep dying slowly without understanding why. By midnight, he had made his decision. He would go back one more time, but not to work. He would go back for proof. The company could threaten him, could try to silence him, but if he had evidence, they couldn't bury the truth forever. He opened his kit and took out a small waterproof camera, checking its seal and charge. Then he set it on the table beside his helmet, staring at it in the dim light. Outside, the river whispered against the hull of the Magnolia Star, steady and calm, as if mocking his turmoil. He had no idea yet how deep this secret went, only that he had already gone too far to turn back. The river was still when Jack woke before dawn, the fog rolling in heavy from the bayou. He hadn't really slept. His dreams had been filled with the glow of his flashlight on corroded barrels and the oily sheen that spread across the current like blood. The memory clung to him as he sat up and looked out the window of the shack. The Magnolia Star loomed in the pale light, her rusted hull rising from the mist like the carcass of something ancient. Somewhere beneath her shadow, the USS Henderson waited, silent and patient. Jack knew he couldn't walk away anymore. The decision had been made the moment he saw the markings on those barrels. He spent the morning preparing in absolute silence. Every movement was deliberate. The tightening of a strap, the check of a valve, the click of a light. He moved with the calm of a man who had accepted his fear, not escaped it. The waterproof camera lay on the table beside his knife, its small red light blinking in the gloom. He packed it carefully into its housing, checked the seal twice, then strapped it to his chest harness. Outside, the first light of dawn filtered through the fog, soft and colorless. Fred Holloway's voice cut through the quiet from the pier. "You heading in again?" His tone was casual, but the weight behind it wasn't. Jack turned to face him. "Need to clear the last of that chain," he said evenly. "If I can free it today, the propeller will be ready by tomorrow." Holloway's eyes flickered toward the river, then back to Jack. "Good. Let's get this finished." He turned and walked away, but Jack noticed the radio clipped to his belt and the small earpiece tucked beneath his cap. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Someone else was listening. The dive began like the others, with a slow descent into darkness, the hiss of air, the flicker of light. But Jack felt the difference immediately. The water seemed colder, heavier, and the silence deeper. The Magnolia Star faded above him until there was nothing but the pulse of his lamp cutting through the green haze. He followed the chain down, link by link, the motion automatic. When the shadow of the Henderson appeared again, his breath quickened despite himself. It crouched on the riverbed like a sleeping monster, its steel ribs hidden beneath silt and memory. He made for the breach in the hull, the same jagged opening he had entered before. Inside, the ship felt tighter than he remembered, the corridors narrower, the darkness thicker. He moved slowly, every sound magnified, the creak of his harness, the hiss of his exhale. When he reached the storage compartment, his light swept across the barrels again. They looked worse now, the ruptures deeper, the leak more visible. A thin cloud of dark particles drifted up from the cracks, spiraling lazily toward him. Jack steadied his camera, began recording, and captured everything. The faded markings, the slick floating in the current, the twisted bolts sealing the chain to the deck. He felt the weight of history pressing on him. These weren't random containers. They'd been packed with care, sealed, then hidden. He remembered the stories his Navy mentor used to tell. The ones about experimental munitions, chemical stockpiles that had been disposed of after the war, the kind of cargo no one was supposed to admit existed. He imagined the men who had made the decision to sink this ship, how easy it must have been to believe that a river could erase guilt. But the river never forgets. When he turned to leave, something flickered in the corner of his vision, a faint shimmer deeper in the corridor, like light reflecting off glass. He froze. It wasn't his lamp. It was another source of light, faint but moving. For an instant, he thought it was a trick of his eyes until it shifted again. Someone else was down here. He killed his lamp instinctively, heart hammering. The water turned to pitch. He waited, barely breathing, as the faint glow passed across the bulkhead and then vanished into another compartment. He knew then that Holloway hadn't sent him alone. Someone had followed, probably to make sure he didn't find what he wasn't supposed to. Jack switched his light back on at its dimmest setting and started for the exit, keeping low, careful not to disturb the silt. Every second stretched like an hour. When he reached the hatch, he kicked off hard and let the current pull him away from the wreck. His lungs burned, But he didn't slow until the hull of the Magnolia Star appeared above him. Breaking the surface, he ripped off his mask and gasped for air. The pier was empty, or so it seemed. He hauled himself up quietly, dripping and shaking, and scanned the shack. Holloway was nowhere in sight, but Jack could feel eyes on him. He moved quickly, stripped off his gear, and stashed the camera deep in his duffel. Then he walked toward the shack as if nothing had happened. Holloway emerged from the shadows, his expression unreadable. "How'd it go?" he asked. Jack kept his voice steady, chains almost clear. "Another few hours. I'll have it loose." Holloway nodded slowly, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You look tired, Harper. Maybe take the rest of the day off." Jack forced a half smile. "Might do that." That night, the rain came hard. It beat against the tin roof of the shack in relentless rhythm. Jack sat at the table, the camera in his hands. He watched the footage again and again, his gut tightening with each frame. The barrels, the leaks, the serial numbers, proof of everything he had suspected. He copied the files onto a small drive and slipped it into a waterproof envelope. If he didn't make it out, at least the evidence would. Sometime after midnight, he heard movement outside. A car door closing softly, boots on wet wood. The doorknob turned once, gently. Jack's pulse quickened. He reached for his knife and crouched low beside the bed. The door opened a few inches before stopping, as if whoever was there had thought better of it. After a long moment, the steps retreated, fading into the storm. He didn't sleep after that. By dawn, his decision was final. He couldn't stay. He couldn't trust Holloway or anyone connected to him. He would drive into Baton Rouge, find a contact from his Navy days, and hand over the footage. The truth had to reach someone who could act before the men behind this buried it again. When the sun rose, Jack stepped onto the pier one last time. The Magnolia Star stood silent in the mist, the river flowing around her as if nothing beneath mattered. But Jack knew better. The poison didn't sleep, and neither did guilt. He touched the edge of the railing, then turned toward the road. The moment he started his truck, a figure appeared in the rearview mirror. Holloway, standing at the edge of the pier, watching him leave with an expression that was no longer curiosity, but certainty. Jack knew what that meant. He wasn't just leaving a job behind. He was running from men who couldn't afford to let him live. The morning sky over the bayou was pale and brittle when Jack Harper left the pier behind. The gravel crunched beneath his tires as he steered his old truck down the winding road that cut through the swamp. The mist curling around the trees like smoke. Every mile felt like borrowed time. The small waterproof envelope containing the flash drive lay on the seat beside him, its presence heavy as a weapon. It was everything, the truth, the proof, and his only defense. He kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see Holloway's truck following. For the first few miles, there was nothing but the empty road. Then, far back in the fog, a dark shape appeared. His pulse quickened. He pressed harder on the gas. The shape grew clearer with each turn of the road. A black SUV, government issue, or corporate, he couldn't tell. It stayed just far enough behind to let him know it was there. Jack's jaw tightened. He had driven enough convoys in his Navy years to recognize a tail. They weren't rushing him. They were waiting for him to panic. The thought made him calm instead of afraid. He took a side road he knew from his early dives, a narrow, twisting track that led toward a service dock miles upriver. The truck followed. He didn't need to look anymore to know it was there. By the time he reached the dock, the rain had started again, soft at first and then steady. He pulled over near a rusted boathouse and killed the engine. For a long moment, he sat still, listening to the rain on the windshield, the dull hiss of tires on distant pavement. Then he reached for the envelope and slipped it into a waterproof case he had hidden in the glove compartment. He took out his camera, too, checked the files one last time, and then set everything inside a weatherproof bag. If they were going to come for him, they wouldn't get the truth along with him. He climbed out of the truck, the air thick and cold, and walked down to the water's edge. The river moved slow here, brown and swollen, its surface broken by the occasional drift of debris. He crouched and wedged the sealed bag into the hollow of a half-submerged piling, pressing it deep beneath a tangle of roots. It would be safe there, at least for a little while. When he stood again, the sound of an engine grew behind him. Headlights cut through the rain. The SUV rolled to a stop a few yards away. Holloway stepped out, his jacket soaked through, his expression calm, but his eyes hard. Two other men followed him, silhouettes in the mist. "You've had a busy few days, Harper," Holloway said, his voice low but steady. "You should have stuck to the job." Jack met his gaze without flinching. "You knew what was down there." Holloway didn't deny it. "It was supposed to stay buried. Sometimes that's what's best for everyone." Jack took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the water behind him and the gun under Holloway's coat. "For everyone," he said, "or for the people who caused it." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Holloway sighed and stepped closer. "You sent it, didn't you?" he asked. "The footage? The story?" Jack hesitated just long enough for the truth to show in his eyes. Holloway's expression hardened. "You don't understand what you've done." "No," Jack said quietly. "I understand exactly." The first shot cracked through the rain, echoing across the river. Jack dove sideways, the impact of the bullet tearing into the dock where he had been standing. He hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of him and scrambled behind the wooden supports. Another shot splintered the post above his head. He reached for the knife at his belt, but stopped when he saw Holloway advancing. The man's face was pale, his jaw tight. "It didn't have to go this way," Holloway said. "You could have walked away." Jack rose slowly from behind the post, rain running down his face, and met his eyes. "I've walked away from too many things," he said. "Not this one." For a moment, the world held still, suspended between rain and breath. Then, from the distance, the sound of another engine rose. Multiple engines this time, echoing across the water. Holloway turned, his hand tightening on the gun. Blue lights flickered faintly through the trees. Sirens. Jack had mailed the evidence 2 days ago, but he had also sent a copy through an old Navy contact. They must have acted faster than he dared to hope. The men by the SUV looked uncertain now, glancing toward the approaching lights. Holloway's cum cracked for the first time. He aimed his gun at Jack again, but his hand trembled. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted over the growing noise. "You think anyone cares?" Jack shook his head. "They will." The sirens grew louder until they drowned the rain. The SUV doors slammed as Holloway's men retreated, but he didn't move. He stood there, staring at Jack, his weapon lowering slowly. Then he turned and walked toward the car. The tires spun in the mud as they sped off into the fog, swallowed by the trees. Jack stayed standing at the edge of the dock, breathing hard, his heart pounding like it was trying to break through his ribs. When the vehicles arrived, state police, environmental response units, even a Navy truck, Jack said nothing. He watched as the officers spread out along the bank, setting up floodlights that turned the water to molten silver. Divers prepared to go down. Helicopters circled overhead. The old Magnolia Star was about to lose her last secret. Hours later, standing under the awning of the boathouse, Jack watched as the wreck was marked off with buoys and sealed barrels were lifted from the depths, each one dripping black water. The officials spoke in hushed voices, but he caught enough to know they understood what they had found. It was the proof he had risked everything for. The poison would be contained, the truth impossible to bury again. One of the younger officers approached him. "You, Harper." Jack nodded. The man handed him a clipboard. "They said you were the one who sent the evidence. You saved a lot of lives." Jack looked down at the paper, his name printed neatly beside the words, "Primary Witness." He signed it without speaking. When night fell, the lights over the river glowed like ghosts. The Magnolia Star still loomed over the water, but her shadow no longer hid anything. The chain that had once bound her to the wreck lay coiled on the dock, rust flaking away with each drop of rain. Jack stood beside it, watching the current carry the last of the oil slick downstream. For the first time in days, he felt the pressure in his chest ease. He drove away before sunrise, the swamp fading behind him as the road opened toward the horizon. He didn't know where he was headed. Maybe north, maybe home. Wherever that was now. But the road felt lighter beneath his wheels. The truth was out. The river could breathe again. And though his name might never appear in the headlines, though no one in those quiet towns would know who had fought for them, Jack Harper knew that he had done what was right. As the first light of morning broke across the sky, he looked in the mirror one last time. The road behind him was empty, just fog and trees. The water shimmered in the distance, no longer hiding anything, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. Leave a like and subscribe. More secrets that were never meant to surface are still to come.